The year was 1944. Across the oceans, the world was burning, cities swallowed by flame, nations gasping under the weight of their own ruins. Yet far from the front lines, under the blinding sun of the American Midwest, a different kind of story unfolded. The war's noise faded into the hum of cicadas, the wind moving softly through fields of wheat. Beyond rows of barbed wire and whitewashed fences stood a camp, neat, orderly, and impossibly calm. Inside it lived women who had once served the Reich, not soldiers now, but prisoners. They had crossed the Atlantic in silence, packed into gray ships that smelled of rust and salt. Every mile carried them farther from everything familiar, from the voices, the banners, the fear that had defined them. They expected vengeance. They expected cruelty. They expected to pay. But when the truck stopped and the canvas flaps lifted, the first thing they saw was sunlight. Warm, ordinary sunlight over a land untouched by war. The guards who waited for them were young, almost boyish, their expressions steady but not unkind. There were no shouts, no blows, no humiliation, and only quiet instructions, order, and the faint scent of coffee drifting from somewhere nearby. For the women who had lived through bombings and chaos, this calm felt unreal, as if they had stepped not into captivity but into a dream. They looked at the fences, the watchtowers, the distant fields, and felt the confusion sink deeper than fear. How could the enemy be so calm, so civilized, so human? None of them knew it yet. But what awaited them behind those fences would not just feed their bodies. It would starve their beliefs and until only truth remained. The truck slowed to a crawl as the dust rose behind them, thick and golden under the Kansas sun. Inside, the women said nothing. They had been silent since dawn, their throats dry, their hands stiff from gripping the wooden benches. The air smelled of oil and fear. When the engines finally died, a strange stillness fell, the kind that came after too many days of noise. One of them, a young woman named Helga, dared to peek through a tear in the canvas. What she saw didn't make sense. There were no ruins, no soldiers with drawn rifles, no shouting crowds. Just an endless sea of wheat shimmering in the light, and rows of small white buildings neatly lined behind fences. The tailgate dropped with a metallic groan, and sunlight poured in like an accusation. The women squinted, half expecting mockery, half expecting blows. None came. The men who waited for them were American, young, uniformed, alert, yet strangely quiet. Their rifles were held low, their posture firm but not threatening. "Out," one of them said, motioning calmly. The voice was steady, not cruel. The women stepped down one by one, their boots crunching on gravel. The ground felt too solid after weeks at sea. Behind them, the wind carried the faint scent of grain and something else. Roasted food, maybe, or coffee. The absurdity of it made Helga's throat tighten. They had crossed an ocean believing they'd be punished, paraded, maybe starved. Instead, they stood in a landscape that looked like peace itself. The camp was simple. Wooden barracks painted beige, surrounded by barbed wire that gleamed in the light. Beyond it, the fields rolled endlessly, as if freedom itself had no walls. Everything was tidy, squared, and unnervingly calm. Inside the barracks, clean sheets waited on narrow bunks. There was a stove, a bucket of water, even a broom by the door. Soap, real soap, lay wrapped in paper beside each bed. For a moment, the women simply stared. Amerikanische Täuschung, one muttered. American deception. But deception didn't smell like lemon-scented soap or feel like soft blankets under calloused fingers. As evening came, the first bell rang, sharp, metallic, echoing through the camp. The women flinched instinctively. In Europe, that sound meant orders, inspections, punishment. Here it meant something else. The guards didn't shout. They only gestured toward a long wooden building with windows aglow. The mess hall. Helga followed the others, her steps slow, her chest tight. The smell hit before she saw the food, rich, heavy, alive with warmth. It wasn't the gray gruel of ration lines. It was meat, potatoes, butter, and coffee. Real coffee. Her mind refused to process it. Inside, American cooks moved with quiet precision. They didn't leer, didn't gloat. They simply worked, serving food with the same order they might have offered their own. When Helga's turn came, a tray slid toward her. Smooth metal, clean, almost shining. Onto it fell a slice of meatloaf, a mound of mashed potatoes, bright corn, a small roll of bread, and a wedge of pie that looked impossibly golden. Her fingers trembled as she carried it to the table. Around her, the others sat stiffly, staring down at the trays as if expecting a trap. No one spoke. Then one woman whispered, "It smells like home," and that was the moment the silence cracked. The first spoonful felt like betrayal. Warm, rich, and heavy with flavor that memory had long forgotten. For a moment, Helga couldn't move. The stew's aroma mingled with the faint smell of soap still clinging to her hands, and something in her chest twisted. She'd braced herself for cruelty, for the taste of humiliation, not for food that reminded her of her mother's kitchen before the bombs fell. Across the table, the other women ate in silence, their movements mechanical. The clink of metal against tray echoed softly in the room, the only rhythm in a space thick with disbelief. No one dared speak. It was as if words might shatter whatever strange dream they'd stumbled into. At the far end of the hall, an American sergeant leaned against the wall, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. His face was young but lined from years of duty, and though his uniform was pressed sharp, his eyes were tired, not with hate, but with the weariness of someone who had seen too much of the world's madness. He watched quietly as the prisoners ate, not with suspicion, but with the detached calm of a man ensuring order, not vengeance. When Helga finished, she stared down at her empty tray. She felt full for the first time in months, yet emptiness gnawed somewhere deeper, a hollow confusion that food couldn't touch. Around her, the women began stacking their trays as they'd seen the others do. The Americans didn't shout orders. They merely gestured, and somehow the room obeyed. Discipline without fear, authority without cruelty. It unsettled her more than shouting ever could. That night in the barracks, the whispers began. "It's a trick," said one voice in the dark. "They want us to let our guard down," another replied softly. "Or maybe this is how they live." No one had an answer. The idea that kindness could exist without an agenda felt more dangerous than punishment. It challenged everything they'd been told, everything they'd believed. Days turned into routine. Wake up at dawn, stand in line for roll call, perform assigned tasks. The guards spoke little, but their tone remained steady, their faces unreadable. They enforced rules with the efficiency of a machine, yet never with cruelty. The women swept the barracks, washed laundry, peeled vegetables for the kitchen. Even the way the Americans handed out tools, orderly, measured, fair, and carried a quiet logic that didn't fit into their world of propaganda and fear. One morning, while hanging sheets to dry, Helga noticed laughter drifting from beyond the fence. A group of American soldiers were playing baseball, their uniforms dusty, their shouts unrestrained. The sound was alien, laughter without fear, joy without guilt. She stood frozen, listening. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, and it struck her like sunlight through smoke. That evening, she told Elise, her closest friend, what she'd seen. "They were laughing," Helga said quietly, "as if none of this, the war, the death, even existed." Elise looked up from her bunk. "Maybe they can laugh because they aren't afraid of each other." Helga frowned. "We were never allowed to laugh like that." Elise smiled faintly. "No, we were taught to march instead." The next day, Helga was assigned to kitchen duty. The task felt humiliating at first, yet what she saw inside the mess hall unsettled her even more. The American cooks moved with precision, each man focused, each action deliberate. There was no shouting, no chaos, no wasted motion. It was the kind of discipline she'd been told only Germans possessed. Yet here it was, effortless, calm, and strangely humane. When lunch began, she stood behind the counter, ladling soup into trays. The smell of onions and herbs filled the air. For the first time, she saw the Americans up close. Boys, really. Some barely old enough to shave. They smiled occasionally, small polite gestures that held no mockery. The sight disarmed her. The enemy wasn't monstrous. He was ordinary. That evening, the women received their next meal, sandwiches, fruit, and coffee. Real coffee again. The bitterness on Helga's tongue felt almost holy. She remembered the bitter grain substitute they'd drunk back home, dark and thin as despair. This coffee was strong, fragrant, alive. She sipped slowly, trying to make it last. The bell marked the end of dinner. The prisoners filed out quietly, walking past guards who nodded curtly as they passed. No shouting, no violence, just structure. The sky outside was turning gold, the fences casting long shadows across the ground. In the distance, the baseball field glowed under the fading light. Helga stopped for a moment, watching the soldiers gather their equipment, laughing again as they left the field. For a brief second, she forgot which side of the wire she was on. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The barracks were quiet except for the low hum of the stove and the faint snore of exhausted women. Helga lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her stomach was full, but her mind was restless. Everything she had believed, that Americans were brutal, that captivity meant degradation, was eroding piece by piece, undone by bread, butter, and silence. She thought of the guards' calm faces, of the young cook ladling soup, of the steady rhythm of the camp. None of it made sense in the world she'd been taught to hate. And yet it was real as the scent of coffee that still lingered faintly on her sleeve. By morning, something in her had shifted, not broken, not yet, but cracked. Winter crept in quietly that year, coating the camp in frost and silence. The fields beyond the barbed wire turned pale and brittle, their golden shimmer replaced by thin white dust. Inside the barracks, the air smelled of wood smoke and soap, a strange mix of comfort and captivity. The women had grown used to routine now, the roll calls, the meals, the quiet efficiency of their guards. But beneath the rhythm, something fragile had begun to stir: guilt. It arrived in thin envelopes. One morning, a soldier carried a canvas bag through the compound, calling out names. The women gathered like shadows, their hands trembling as they reached for the letters. They came from across a broken continent, from mothers, husbands, sisters, each one stamped, censored, and marked with the dust of a dying homeland. Helga tore hers open with numb fingers. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. Her mother's handwriting, once neat and strong, had turned shaky. "The nights are cold," it read. "We burn furniture to keep the baby warm. Bread is gone. Your father is gone too. Not dead, we think, but gone. We survive on boiled grass. The neighbor's house was hit last month. We wait for peace if it still exists." Helga read it twice, then a third time. By the last line, the words were blurring. That evening, when the bell rang for dinner, she couldn't move. The scent of food drifted through the cracks in the door, meat and onions, but it made her stomach turn. The others hesitated too. One woman whispered, "How can we eat while they starve?" Another answered softly, "Because they feed us anyway." The sentence cut through the room like cold air. Eventually they went, because hunger always wins. The mess hall was warm, glowing with lamplight. The Americans moved with their usual precision, steady hands, calm eyes, no hint of triumph. Each woman received the same portion: stew, bread, coffee, nothing more, nothing less. Helga sat at her usual spot, staring down at the steaming bowl before her. The smell was rich, comforting, and unbearable. When she finally lifted the spoon, it felt like betrayal. Every bite filled her stomach and hollowed her soul. Across the table, Elise ate quietly, her eyes distant. "Do you think," she said after a moment, "they know what's happening back home?" Helga shook her head. "Maybe they don't care." Elise paused, then whispered, "Or maybe that's why they feed us, because they can afford to care." That thought lingered long after the meal ended. Days passed, each one colder than the last. More letters arrived, each one heavier with grief. Cities were gone: Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden. Children were starving. The Reich that had promised victory now traded its pride for survival. Inside the camp, stoves burned and plates stayed full. It was a cruel contrast: warmth against ashes, order against collapse. The women stopped laughing. They began to eat slower, heads bowed, each meal a silent confession. One morning, a Red Cross truck arrived at the gate. Out stepped a woman in a gray coat, her face calm, her accent faintly Swiss. She carried parcels wrapped in brown paper and a ledger to sign for them. When she opened the packages, the prisoners froze. Chocolate. Real, glossy, dark chocolate, the kind that hadn't been seen in Germany since before the war. For a moment, no one moved. Then one woman refused it, shaking her head as tears filled her eyes. Another accepted hers slowly, holding it like something sacred. That night, after lights out, Helga broke her piece into small squares and passed them quietly down the row of bunks. The taste was overwhelming, sweet, rich, and unbearably human. It brought back memories of a Leipzig Christmas long before uniforms and sirens. Her father carving bread, her mother laughing. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of everything she'd lost. The next morning, she couldn't finish breakfast. The oatmeal tasted like ashes. Around her, others were struggling too. The food that once felt like mercy now felt like judgment. Outside, the guards moved with their same unshaken calm. They saluted their officers, carried out orders, and spoke to each other with a quiet dignity that didn't fit the image the women had once been taught. The enemy was supposed to be brutal, not orderly, not humane. As Helga watched them, she began to see the cruel irony. Their captors lived by a code her own side had long abandoned. The American strength wasn't in their guns, but in their restraint, a kind of discipline that came from peace, not fear. That night, as the wind howled through the cracks of the barracks, she sat by the stove staring into the small flame. "We were taught they were animals," she murmured. "But if this is what animals do, what does that make us?" No one answered. The fire popped, and the silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. Outside, snow began to fall, quiet, indifferent, and endless. Inside, the women stared into their bowls, tasting guilt with every spoonful. For the first time, Helga understood that defeat didn't always come with violence. Sometimes it came on a tray, warm, simple, and offered without hate. Spring returned slowly, as if the world had forgotten what warmth felt like. The snow melted into soft mud, and the wheat fields beyond the fences began to turn green again. Inside the camp, the women could smell earth instead of smoke for the first time in years. Birds sang somewhere beyond the wire, their songs fragile, almost embarrassed to exist in a place built for prisoners. The war outside was collapsing, though no one knew how close it was to ending. Rumors whispered through the barracks: Hitler in hiding, cities lost, generals surrendering. Each day the women waited for confirmation, for some word that the nightmare had finally burned itself out. Helga kept her mother's last letter folded inside her pocket. She had read it so often that the creases had begun to tear. It was a relic now, the last piece of a life that no longer existed. Each meal she ate, each morning she woke warm and fed, made the guilt cut deeper. But the Americans didn't change. They remained steady, polite, distant, a kind of calm that neither rose to pity nor fell into cruelty. They did not speak of the war. They did not gloat. They simply continued as if morality itself required no announcement. One afternoon, Helga and Elise were sent to help repair uniforms in the sewing building. The task was quiet, repetitive. Needles clicked, scissors whispered through fabric, and for a few hours the women worked side by side with American soldiers. There was no shouting, no hierarchy, only murmured instructions. One of the soldiers, a freckled boy with sandy hair, hummed as he worked. The tune was unfamiliar, something bright, almost joyful. "Do you know what that is?" Elise whispered. Helga shook her head. "A hymn, maybe?" The boy glanced up, catching their curiosity. "It's a song," he said in careful German. "From back home." They didn't answer, and he returned to his stitching, the melody fading into the steady rhythm of sewing machines. But the moment lingered, another fracture in the wall that separated captor from captive. That night, as the prisoners ate their dinner, vegetable stew and bread, one of the guards turned on a radio. The music that drifted through the mess hall froze them in place. The voice was soft, almost ghostly, singing Lily Marlene. For a moment, no one breathed. It was the song they had heard in barracks across Europe, in trenches, in bunkers. Both sides of the war had claimed it as their own. Hearing it here under the American flag felt surreal. Elise whispered, "They listened to it too." Helga nodded slowly. "Maybe it belongs to no one." The song played on, threading through the sound of clinking trays and murmured conversation. It didn't matter which side had won or lost. For a brief moment the war seemed smaller. Two nations divided by belief, bound by melody. Days passed, and with them came a new kind of tension. Not fear, but anticipation. Something was ending. The guards' faces had changed, their movements slower, their eyes distant. Then, one warm afternoon, the rumor became fact. The women were called into the yard. The commandant, a tall officer with gray at his temples, stood before them, flanked by American soldiers. His voice was steady as the translator spoke. "The war in Europe is over," he said. "Germany has surrendered." The words hung in the air, unreal. For a moment, the camp was silent. Then came the reactions. Sharp breaths, muffled cries, hands pressed to mouths. One woman dropped to her knees. Another began to laugh. a broken, disbelieving sound. Helga felt her body go cold. Surrender. The Reich that had promised eternity had lasted barely 12 years. She didn't feel joy or grief, only emptiness. That evening, the mess hall was quieter than ever. The Americans served roast chicken and bread, a meal heavier than usual as if to mark the moment. No speeches, no celebrations, just food and silence. Helga sat across from Elise, who stared down at her plate without eating. "It's over," Elise whispered. Helga nodded. "Then why does it still feel like we lost more than a war?" When they finished, the women lingered outside. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of wet grass and smoke from distant fires. Beyond the fence, the sun dipped low, bleeding red across the fields. Elise looked toward the horizon. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Helga followed her gaze. "Home," she said softly, "or what's left of it." They stood together in silence. Behind them, the American flag fluttered gently in the evening breeze. For the first time in years, there were no air raids, no sirens, no orders shouted in panic. The world felt still, but it was a strange, uneasy stillness. That night, lying in her bunk, Helga listened to the quiet hum of life inside the camp. The wind against the walls, the soft breathing of sleeping women, the distant footsteps of a guard on patrol. It struck her that captivity had given her something freedom had not: time to see clearly. The war had demanded obedience. This place, this strange island of order and decency, demanded reflection, and in that reflection, she began to see the truth her nation had hidden: that mercy was not weakness, and that true power needed no cruelty to prove itself. As she drifted toward sleep, the echo of Lily Marlene replayed faintly in her memory. She didn't know whose side it belonged to anymore. Perhaps it didn't matter. The weeks after Germany's surrender passed in a haze of quiet routine. The guards still called roll, the bell still rang for meals, and the sun still climbed over the same wire fences. The war might have ended, but the habits of captivity lingered. The camp was unchanged, yet something in the air had shifted, a gentleness, a fatigue, a strange understanding that none of them could quite name. The Red Cross arrived first, driving through the gates with white jeeps marked by crimson crosses. The inspectors walked the grounds, spoke to the prisoners, and noted the same thing in every report. The women looked healthy, their spirits subdued but calm. They didn't know what couldn't be written on paper, that kindness, steady and unrelenting, had dismantled belief faster than any battlefield. Helga now worked in the garden beside the laundry house. She wore the same faded uniform she had arrived in, its color bleached by sun and soap. Her hands were rough from digging, but she didn't mind. The act of planting something, of coaxing life from soil, felt like rebellion against the destruction she had once accepted without question. The Americans were patient with their work. They gave them tools, seeds, water, and then simply stepped back. No one mocked. No one hurried. They treated them as workers, not enemies. And in that quiet cooperation, a strange peace began to bloom. Fragile but real. In the evenings, music drifted from the guardhouse. Sometimes jazz, sometimes a slow tune that made the horizon feel endless. The women would pause their chores, listening through the dusk. It was music that sounded free, not triumphant, just alive. One night, a familiar melody floated through the air again, Lily Marlene. The same song that had haunted trenches and airfields now hummed from an American radio. Helga and Elise sat on the barracks steps watching the last light fade. "It follows us," Elise murmured. "Even here," Helga smiled faintly. "Maybe it doesn't belong to anyone anymore. Maybe it just survived, like us." Soon after, word came that some of them would be repatriated. The process would take months, they said. Trains, ships, paperwork, everything moved slower in peace than in war. Some women were eager to go, desperate for what little remained of home. Others hesitated. Home no longer meant safety. It meant ruins, ration lines, and memories they weren't ready to face. When Helga received her notice, she sat for a long time staring at the paper. The thought of leaving this place, this paradox of captivity and dignity, filled her with something she hadn't felt in years: fear. On her last evening, the camp was unusually quiet. Dinner was simple: bread, beans, and coffee, but the cooks added something extra: a slice of pie. It was small, ordinary, yet it carried a weight words couldn't hold. The Americans said little as they served it. The act spoke for itself. After the meal, Helga walked toward the gate where a group of women waited to be processed. The young sergeant who had once watched them in the mess hall stood nearby. He caught her gaze and gave a small nod. "Good luck," he said, his voice steady, polite. For a moment, Helga couldn't speak. She wanted to say something. Thank you, maybe, or I'm sorry. But the words stuck, so she only nodded back. As she stepped through the gate, the gravel crunching beneath her boots, she turned once to look behind her. The camp lay bathed in the soft glow of sunset. The fences still stood, but they no longer looked like prisons. They looked like boundaries between two worlds, one built on fear and one that had learned to live without it. Years later, when Helga had children of her own, she rarely spoke of the war. When she did, she never spoke of battles or victories. She spoke of the meals, the smell of coffee, the taste of butter, the silence of being treated as human when she least deserved it. Her granddaughter once asked, "Grandmother, did they forgive you?" Helga smiled sadly. "They never said the word," she replied. "They just showed it 3 times a day." The memory lingered with her always. The order, the calm, the food that had undone a lifetime of lies. For the women of that camp, defeat hadn't come with chains or hunger. It had come on trays of warm food, served by men who refused to hate them. And when history tried to measure power in guns and empires, Helga knew the truth lay somewhere simpler, in a slice of bread freely given, in a cup of coffee poured without malice, in the quiet decency that could dismantle an entire ideology. In the end, the women didn't remember the fences or the guards. They remembered the scent of roasted corn, the shine of metal trays, and the shock of realizing that mercy could wound more deeply than cruelty. Because in those strange, suspended months of captivity, they had seen the most powerful weapon of all, humanity. Decades passed. The camp in Kansas was long gone, its barracks dismantled, its fences swallowed by wheat fields. Only the faint outline of gravel roads remained, visible from the air like scars on healed skin. To the people who drove past, it was just farmland. But for those who had once lived behind those wires, it was sacred ground, the place where hatred had starved, and humanity had quietly taken its place. Helga lived a quiet life after returning to Germany. Her village was gone, her family scattered, her home reduced to a shell of brick and ash. Like many others, she rebuilt with what she had: bricks, bread, and silence. The war had left her a survivor, but it had also made her a witness. In the years that followed, she rarely spoke of America. When neighbors raged about the humiliation or the lost glory, she stayed quiet. When others glorified fallen leaders, she turned away. The memories she carried didn't fit their stories. She had seen something that didn't belong in their bitterness, a version of strength that didn't shout, didn't punish, didn't demand obedience. Sometimes, on summer mornings, she'd stand by the window, stirring her coffee. The smell would take her back to that Kansas camp. The metal trays, the clean sheets, the sunlight slanting across the mess hall. And she would remember the day she realized the war hadn't been about victory at all. It had been about who could remain human when everything else had turned to ash. Her children grew up in peace, and her grandchildren never saw uniforms or barbed wire. But one afternoon, when her granddaughter Lena was 12, she found an old box in the attic. Inside were folded papers, a tin cup, and a small piece of brown wrapper, the kind that once held butter. "What's this, Oma?" she asked, holding it up. Helga took it gently, her fingers trembling. "That," she said softly, "is what taught me the meaning of freedom." Lena frowned. "Butter?" Helga smiled faintly. "No, the choice to share it." For a moment the two sat in silence. Then Helga began to speak, slowly, carefully, for the first time in decades. She told the story of the camp, of the food, of the quiet decency that had changed her life. She didn't dramatize, didn't embellish. She simply told it as it was, the truth of kindness where cruelty was expected. Lena listened, wide-eyed. "Did they ever hurt you?" she asked. Helga shook her head. "No. That was the hardest part to understand." That night, after Lena went to bed, Helga sat by the window again, the moonlight spilling over the butter wrapper. She realized that the Americans hadn't just fed their prisoners, they had fed something deeper, the belief that compassion was not weakness, that justice could be firm without being cruel. That dignity, once given, multiplies. In her final years, she wrote the story down in a notebook, plain, unsentimental, and honest. Not to excuse, not to glorify, but to remember. She titled it They Called This Lunch. When she passed away in 1989, Lena found the notebook among her things. Decades later, she donated it to a small museum in Topeka, Kansas, where former POW camps once stood. Visitors who read it often paused at one line, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. They defeated us without hatred, and that is why their victory lasted. The curators placed her butter wrapper beside the note, fragile, yellowed, ordinary. Yet under the glass it glowed like gold, and so the story lived on, not as a tale of war, but as proof of what humanity looks like when it refuses to mirror its enemies. Because in the end, history remembers battles, but people remember kindness. If this story moved you, share it. Because stories like Helga's remind us that even in war, compassion can rewrite history. Subscribe for more true, emotional, and untold human stories from World War II. Stories that reveal not just how the world fought, but how it healed. History isn't just what happened. It's what humanity chose to become afterward.